Good evening all and welcome to day 2 of Cryptid Week. Tonight we're going to be heading into the deep woods for a chilling collection of Bigfoot scary stories. I'd like to give a shout out first though to Mortis Mike. I really hope that your treatment is going well and that you're fully recovered soon. Stay strong, my friend. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. A few days ago, my grandmother shared a story from her childhood that she had apparently kept mostly to herself for decades, and the way she told it made it clear to me that the memory still upsets her all these years later. So when she was around 8 years old, she lived with her sisters and parents in a very small house sitting alone in the middle of a wide open field. It was far removed from town and separated from neighbors by miles of farmland. The house stood isolated against the landscape, with thick clusters of trees lining the back portion of the property, forming a dark wooded barrier. A single narrow dirt road connected their home to the outside world, stretching out across the field in a long strip of pale earth that turned to mud whenever it rained, and made it difficult to travel during certain seasons. One night in May of 1964, after an ordinary evening, she and her sisters went to bed as they always did, sharing a small bedroom that barely fit their beds in a dresser. She told me she had been asleep for roughly 2 hours when she suddenly woke without understanding why, immediately overwhelmed by the intense sensation that someone or something was watching her from outside the room. Their bedroom had one small window positioned high on the wall, and sitting roughly 6 feet above the floor, which meant no one could casually glance inside without making a deliberate effort to reach it. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she slowly turned her head towards the window, and that was when she saw 2 glowing eyes staring directly at her from the other side of the glass. She described the eyes as bright and reflective, rather than softly illuminated, positioned high enough that whatever they belonged to would have been standing well above the height of an ordinary person. Fear gripped her instantly, and instead of screaming, she reached over and shook one of her sisters awake, whispering urgently for her to look towards the window. Her sister reacted immediately once she saw the same thing, pulling the blanket over her head in panic while trying not to cry loudly. The 2 of them lay frozen beneath their covers, hearts pounding, barely daring to breathe while those glowing eyes remained fixed on them through the darkness. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity stretched thin by fear, the eyes moved away from the window and disappeared from sight without an accompanying sound that might explain how something so large had approached or retreated. Neither of them slept for the rest of the night, instead waiting for morning light to push back the terror that had filled their room. When they told their mother what happened, she dismissed the story as imagination fueled by dreams and the natural fears of children living in such an isolated place. That disbelief lasted only until the family stepped outside to examine the ground beneath the bedroom window, where they found enormous footprints pressed deep into the soil, leading from the edge of the woods up into the house and back again. My grandmother said the prints were far larger than any boot her father owned, spaced in a way that suggested long strides and considerable height, and they sank deeply enough into the earth to imply significant weight. After seeing those tracks for herself, her mother no longer brushed off the story so easily, and from that day forward, my grandmother and her sisters were forbidden from playing anywhere near the tree line behind the house. A few months later, an unsettling detail added another layer to the memory when a neighbor who lived roughly 7 miles away mentioned that several of his cows had disappeared without explanation. He told them there had been no blood, no broken fencing, and no visible sign of struggle anywhere on his property, as though something powerful had simply lifted the animals and carried them off, leaving no evidence behind. Listening to her recount these events, I could see that even now, she has never settled comfortably on a logical explanation for what stood outside that window, or what left those massive tracks in the dirt. The isolation of the property, the reflective eyes at that height, the heavy footprints leading into the woods, and the missing livestock, all combine into something that feels far beyond coincidence. I think it was Bigfoot what she saw. But I'd like to hear if anyone else has an alternative explanation. This happened a few years ago at my parents' house in a small town in Wayne County. Anyone that knows the area knows some parts are very rural. Well, my parents live right in town, not far from the center of it, but in a weird spot. The town only has maybe 500 people in the town limit and is surrounded by farmland and forests. They live right near the railroad tracks and canal, and their backyard is pitch black at night because the streetlights don't reach back there. The yard backs up to a walking trail and woods. It's actually pretty creepy back there after dark, even though it's 2 blocks from downtown. So the night this story takes place, it was extremely dark. I think it was a new moon or a moonless night, and it was overcast to boot. Late summer or early fall, so it was pretty dry, with no mud to capture any footprints. My parents, brother and I were talking in the living room at the front of the house, the part of the house facing the town and lights. Now the house is kind of long and skinny, maybe 40 feet wide by probably 150 feet long. And as we're talking, the family dog stood up, looked around, and started to growl really low. He was a yellow Labrador, about 90 pounds, half deaf and blind from diabetes, but overall still a pretty chill dog. He'd never bark at other dogs and very rarely barked at people, and that's what made this so odd. His hackles went up, and he started barking towards the back of the house. There were at least 2 closed doors before you even get to the room where the back door is. The dog is now like full-on berserk, barking at the closed door in the hallway. We open and follow it to see why he's going nuts. We get to the back door, and are now worried someone has broken in. But when we open it, Marley shot straight to the back door, jumping and barking and snarling, making sounds I've never seen or heard this big baby of a dog make before. As I open the final door for him to step out, he bolts. He was going to attack whatever or whoever was out there. Me and my parents step out onto the back porch and close Marley inside. He still sounds almost rabid. We wait a moment for our eyes to adjust, because the backyard is pitch black. Now we see a silhouette, maybe 50 feet away, standing at the edge of the yard, right near the railroad track access road. Now to say this thing was big is an understatement. It was way over 6 feet tall, probably closer to 8, and extremely broad. I'd think it was a potential burglar that we caught sneaking up to the house if it wasn't so absolutely massive. My parents to this day swear it was a black bear. Officially, according to the DEC, black bears don't live anywhere near this area and haven't for a long time. Also, the size of it would have been a record-sized bear. Also, the reaction of my dog going nuts doesn't seem like a bear would do that. After we had to put Marley inside, and it just sort of stood upright for about 2 minutes, before we decided it was best to go inside, as the hairs on the back of our necks were standing straight on end. The reason it freaked me out was, even at a distance, you could hear it breathe, these deep, raspy breaths. It sounded like it was breathing right next to my ear. They were slow and steady, not like someone who was out of breath. It wasn't like they were trying to make their breath sound loud, it simply was. I immediately went to find a flashlight, but when I got back outside, whatever it was had gone. There were no tracks or any fur. It was just a large silhouette that was simply too large to be a person, but acted unlike any wild animal I've ever encountered. This happened in March of 2018, when I moved from New York to Vermont and rented a house for a few months that allowed my cat and dog while waiting to close on my new home there. The winter brought particularly heavy snow that year, and the house sat up a small mountain dirt road where if 10 cars passed in any given day, I would count it as busy traffic. I booked it through Zillow, thinking it actually lay closer to the village, but planned to stay in anyway to heal up and rest and relax after an exhaustive packing and moving ordeal from the city. Some guy friends helped me get settled up there and left after one night, with warnings not to let my dog run loose off leash due to alpacas at the next door farm, about 1/8 of a mile walking distance away, though my aging dog moved slow at 16 years old and could barely walk anymore anyway. He ranked as one of those awesome great dogs you get lucky to have once or twice in your life, since he got along with anything or anyone around him. The next neighbor lived at least a mile further down the road from that farm. I settled into the lovely one-story home, which featured automated motion detector lights up the driveway running behind the house, where a huge, ancient apple tree stood, with a few apples still high up, even in March, surrounded by the usual pine and birch trees across the property. Large front and back lawn areas spanned several acres surrounded by forests and old rock walls on all sides. I grew up in a New York area full of trees and forests, so felt no spookiness at first until that second night arrived. The house had a large pond out front covered in ice and snow, with at least 4 foot of accumulation on the ground and just enough driveway plowed for cars to access in and out. I backed my car close by the back door for convenience. Several outbuildings dotted the property as well. One open garage-like building sat perhaps 30 feet away from the back door and reached through the kitchen and served as a large garden storage area with no doors and just an open space exposed to the elements. Off the kitchen lay a screened-in porch facing the pond out front, which played a key role in later events. On that second night, I took my dog out on a leash at 8 p.m. when pitch black darkness was all I could see outside. Fresh, fluffy snow, about 1 foot deep, had fallen recently, and as a silly New Yorker, I wore sneakers without socks, a nightgown, and a light jacket, thinking I would stay out for only 5 minutes to let him do his business before bed. I walked him slowly across the snow until ready to head back inside. As I returned to the back door, I realized I had locked myself out by accident, since the doorknob twisted one way to lock automatically behind me. I tried not to panic in the cold, but stood there looking silly, with no flashlight or cell phone, and figured walking to the neighbors risked breaking an ankle in the dark over the unseen snow on the ground. I remember seeing a crowbar in that open garage building nearby, and thought I could pull a MacGyver move like those window break-in shows on television. So I took my dog's leash and tied it around my car's left mirror to secure him temporarily. I knew breaking in meant losing my deposit and paying for damages, but facing freezing temperatures outside, with no way even to enter the car for shelter alongside the dog, I grabbed the crowbar from the garage and after a little hesitancy, swung it hard at the glass window facing away from me. It bounced off, making the loudest, echoing sound through the night air, and even sparked on impact, which surprised me completely. What kind of window refused to break like that, since I counted as a strong person, able to handle physical tasks. Was this bulletproof or safety glass? I tried another window to the left, checking I could climb through if broken, but met the same unbreakable result again, so abandoned that approach for something else. That's when I recalled the screened-in porch off the kitchen. Then I figured if I reached the screened-in porch door leading outside, and if the inner kitchen door stayed unlocked, I need only rip a screen, which cost far less to repair than a full window replacement. I looked around and saw at least 15 feet of snow-packed path that required clearing to access the screen door. So, returned to the garage for the shovel I'd spotted earlier. My hands and legs grew colder with every passing moment outside in the biting air. I shoveled as fast as possible to clear the path, while my dog barked loudly from around the corner, out of sight, since he could not see me working. His barks echoed off the back mountain beyond the forest in the yard, and I yelled at him repeatedly to quiet down until his noise suddenly stopped, which I dismissed as him calming, since I needed to focus on getting inside quickly. I finally reached the screen door and felt grateful it stayed unlocked, so squeezed through, pushing more snow aside to access the kitchen door, hoping it had not locked behind me, and found it open as well. Relief washed over me completely, so I ran through the kitchen to exit the back door again, where I locked out earlier, this time grabbing house keys first before stepping out. I checked the car mirror where I tied the leash and found my dog gone, with the leash hanging loose, looking torn or chewed through, which freaked me out further amid all the other troubles that night. I walked around the back of the house calling for him, and there sat my dog, happy, after doing his business, waddling slowly back towards me across the snow. Relief hit again as I tied the leash into a knot to reuse next day, since it came as a retractable type made for dogs over 100 pounds and measured at least an inch wide with thick material. How he managed to tear through that so quickly remains a mystery I still ponder often. I got to bed finally, vowing never to leave the house again without keys in hand, no matter the circumstance. The next night around 8 p.m, Bigfoot activity announced itself in the neighborhood clearly when I stepped out under a clear night sky, staring up at the stars in disbelief at their beauty after years in the light-polluted New York City. I saw constellations unseen for ages while standing at the back of the house in front of a large picture window overlooking the backyard, and a distant mountain with open garage at my 3 o'clock position to the right side. I stood there only 1 or 2 minutes when I heard a single car knock at the 2 o'clock position and another from the 11 o'clock spot relative to my stance. Those knocks sounded very much like the loud, clear bangs I made the previous night trying to break windows for entry, echoing distantly through the still air. I knew the sound of trees swaying well from experience, but no wind blew that night, and trees stayed motionless, so the noise came deliberately and sharp. But from where? I hightailed it back inside the house in seconds flat and locked all the doors securely behind me. The following night, I thought things stayed normal enough, but events escalated further during the usual routine of walking the dog down the driveway a short distance with all outside lights turned on, since ice covered the ground and I used a ski pole for safe walking, alongside a flashlight while keeping house keys in my jacket pocket always. I started back towards the kitchen door. I glanced beyond the open garage outbuilding because a pop of color caught my eye suddenly. A pair of really large red eyes stared back at me from the edge where the yard edged against a rock wall abutting the dark forest beyond. At first I wondered if an owl caused the glow, but shifted left to right, testing for reflection from house lights, which seemed a good explanation at that moment. Those eyes stayed fixed, however, big red-orange orbs, watching me directly with spacing so wide apart they unnerved me deeply. The distance measured about 100 to 120 feet from my position. Those eyes appeared at least 10 inches apart, suggesting a massive head size I preferred not to imagine fully. I stood frozen for at least a minute, waiting for movement to identify the source until incomprehension hit, and I scurried back inside the house fast, closing the doors tight. The next day I checked the area carefully in daylight, venturing out into the deep snow about 30 feet to search for reflected tin cans or anything explaining the glow from the previous night. I saw absolutely nothing unusual there at all. I grabbed binoculars from inside the house and returned for another look, but found only the rock wall forest edge and birds chirping happily in the trees. I stayed at the rental 3 or 4 more weeks after that without seeing those eyes or any reflection again during remaining nights. This marked not my first possible Bigfoot encounter, since 2 others occurred back in New York State previously. The final kicker came later, when I realized a spare key hung right above the shovel I grabbed that first night, which would have let me back in immediately without all the drama. I received my full security deposit back regardless, and adored the house overall, despite events, though my MacGyver attempts ended for good after that ordeal. I grew up in the great Pacific Northwest, in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, under the shadow of Mount St. Helens in Washington state. It's a land full of myth and legend, mostly from the natives, but a lot of the old-timers, loggers and trappers and hunters, etc., have stories of their own. One of my father's oldest and dearest friends, now passed on, was a local Native American who was one of the oldest of his nation. He was an adult before most of the towns in our area were settled by white people, and his name to us was Charlie. I'm sure he had another native name, but I don't recall what it was. Charlie used to sit us down, kids and adults, and tell us stories. Some of the stories were tribal legends, some of them were things he swore happened to him in the woods, and some of them, he said, were things that other men and women of his tribe or fur trappers and miners in the late 19th century experienced. As I got older, I began to realize that Charlie wasn't just pulling our legs on some of these stories. He genuinely believed them, and a few of them happened to me as I would wander out in the woods and investigate. The most obvious and easiest to prove was the ridge lights or mountain lights. Charlie called them a different name, and locals to this day still tell stories about them. The lights, according to Charlie, had existed as far back as man had. They would appear around the mountains on clear nights and zip around in the air. One of the local legends said the lights were the spirits dancing and playing. I first saw the lights when I was a kid, and several times since then. To me it fits the exact description of a classic UFO, lights that appear to be some form of aircraft that flew in manners impossible for current aircrafts, incredible speeds and course corrections. The last time I saw the ridge lights were in the mid-90s. I have noticed a distinct decrease in reported sightings of them since then as well, but for a while the western foothills of the Cascades were a hotspot for UFO sightings. Speaking of UFOs, it goes a bit further than just seeing lights. When I was a young kid, I woke up in the middle of the night in the little farmhouse we lived in to bright lights outside. They were multicolored and flashing like police car lights, except I seem to recall there was green in there as well. I was curiously unafraid and walked out of my room into the living room, the kitchen, and eventually my parents' room. All the while, in all the windows, there were these bright lights. I tried to wake my parents up, but they were sound asleep. I shrugged it off, went to bed, and woke up in the morning, When I brought it up to my parents, they dismissed it as a dream. I accepted that, especially because one of the odd parts of my story, I couldn't wake up my father, and he was a Vietnam vet who normally woke up at the sound of a mosquito farting. The story would have ended there, if not for our drunken neighbor. Some years later, when I was a teen, I was talking with the now dead neighbor's granddaughter. The neighbor himself was known as a drunken lout and storyteller of the first order. His granddaughter was telling me about how he used to tell these crazy stories, and one day he swore up and down that aliens landed in his field and visited him in the middle of the night. I laughed and said I think I would have seen that, as our yard is connected to his field. She agreed, said something like, "You and your parents would have noticed a bunch of red, green and blue and white flashing lights in your backyard 10 years ago." To be clear, I'm not saying I saw a UFO land in my house. I am saying I might have seen lights that match that description of lights on the supposed spaceship reported to have landed in my unreliable drunken neighbor's yard. And then there's the biggest myth of all. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you call him. Do I believe he exists? Absolutely. Even though I consider myself a man who puts science before superstition, why do I believe in him? Because when I was a child, I saw the footprints. My father even has a plaster cast of one. That was my first encounter. The prints were on the edge of a creek bed in a small ravine, on a piece of wild property my father owned. We found them while surveying the property with a hunter friend. My father insisted it must have been Bigfoot, to which the hunter scoffed and said a man could have made those footprints. To demonstrate, this 6'6", 250-pound hunter climbed on a nearby log, took off his boots, and jumped down into the semi-soft ground. His size 12 feet didn't even make half the indent in the earth next to the other print. The other print was a hand longer than the hunter's, and at least 1.5 inches down. It also had an odd big toe. It was splayed to the side, kind of like a thumb. My dad consulted Charlie for advice. Charlie told him to leave Sasquatch be, and Sasquatch would leave us be. Charlie also told us how to know when Sasquatch was nearby. Nothing else would be, and sometimes you could smell him. He said if you could smell Sasquatch, it was time to get the hell out, because he was a hell of a lot closer than you wanted him to be. As the years went by, we learned to just hike out of the woods if they got dead quiet, and we didn't see signs of any other animals. Only twice do I think I smelled him. Both times it was a heavy, musty, almost moldy odor, like old sweat or wet dog. The second time I was with a girlfriend, and this was in my teen years, and I recalled something else Charlie had said. Never go into Sasquatch territory with a woman who was on her period, because he could smell that and would track her, according to legend, to find a mate. It was the first time I ever asked a girl if she was on her period. She was. Needless to say, quite embarrassed to answer that it was her time of the month. That's when I told her we needed to leave now, and we started out of the woods. We both swore we heard sticks breaking and branches rustling behind us the entire way out, and we both had that terrifying pit in your stomach you get when you know something is watching you. My mum was a teenager at the lake with her family when the incident happened. She reached around 17 years of age at the time. Her brother followed 2 years younger in the group. Their 2 cousins joined them for a campground outing, as well as 2 Saint Bernards accompanying the humans on the walk. They followed a paved path through the campground area that day. The dogs suddenly started losing control and tried to run back along the path. That direction pointed opposite from the cabin where they stayed. The dogs refused to leave my mum and uncle behind in the process. They walked off leashes during the entire trip there. One dog grabbed my mum's shorts in its teeth and pulled her backwards steadily. The behavior resembled a scene pulled straight from a bad comedy movie. Both dogs showed extreme loyalty and protectiveness towards my family, and they remained chill and friendly during most situations around people. The entire group stood around watching the dogs act out in strange ways. Laughter broke out among them at first. No one grasped what was causing the disturbance at the moment, and my mum said they all looked up at the exact same moment together, because one of the dogs started to whimper and cowered down low from apparent terror. All 4 humans turned their head to the trees on the right side of the trailhead, and there, in plain view among the branches, was a creature that was standing maybe 8 feet away from them. My mum guessed its height fell between 8 and 10 feet overall. Dusk approached the area, but full darkness hadn't arrived yet, and at that point, all 4 witnesses remained adamant about the sighting to this day. The figure matched nothing like a bear in shape or movement. No other animal fit the description they observed closely, except perhaps Bigfoot. The creature stared directly at them from just inside the tree-line edge. It crouched low when they locked eyes on it directly. My mum described the motion like a person trying to greet a shy dog from afar. The moment lasted only briefly in real time, before change occurred. The creature straightened up to full height once more. It crossed the path slowly into the trees on the other side of the trail, and it kept eyeballing them the entire way without breaking its gaze. My mum noted no antagonistic or threatening vibes from the posture. The presence felt wary and almost forced casual demeanor instead. That casual air failed to stop the raw terror that gripped my mum and the others completely. They unfroze from the shock after a few moments passed, and they coaxed the dogs to move forward along the path again. The group booked it back to the cabin as fast as their legs allowed them. They told everyone waiting there about the encounters in detail. Some uncles and her other brother and another cousin went out to investigate the area later, but the dogs absolutely refused to approach that path again under any coaxing. The animals freaked out whenever my mum or her siblings headed in that direction, and this reaction lasted for the rest of the weekend without fail. Now, my mum is an extremely rational person in all matters of life. She avoids belief in supernatural things generally across the board, and never exaggerates details or bends the truth in any accounts shared. No one carries more trust for a first-hand story like this one from her directly. My dad provided the next account from about 15 years ago in the woods. He hunted alone in one of his usual areas, as typical for him during those trips. The spot sat 4 miles in from the logging road where he parked his truck in the morning. The sun had just barely risen above the horizon line when he started out on foot. He headed towards a creek used as the central starting point for hunting in that area often. He wandered around the terrain looking for signs of game animal present, and he found absolutely nothing recent in the surrounding woods at all. That scarcity proved very unusual for those specific woods known for activity, and that is when he heard the most terrifying noise he had ever encountered up until that point in his life. The sound came multi-tonal through the trees, as if 2 or 3 voices screamed in disharmonic unison together. The pitches varied across the range, but rose and fell in sync perfectly. They started and ended in the exact same moments without stagger. He would have thought several different voices made it otherwise from the complexity, and every hair on his body stood on end from the noise piercing the air. A horrifying feeling of dread overcame him completely in that instant. The individual pitches sounded rather human-like to his trained ears immediately. The scream lasted longer than any human lungs could sustain without break. He estimated over a minute for the full duration of it. The sound did not pause at any point during its length. It never repeated after ending abruptly in silence. The reverberation suggested it came from very far away through the ridges. The ear-splitting volume made that distance seem impossible to reconcile. He decided to leave the area immediately after that sound stopped echoing. The noise originated from the same general direction as his truck, parked back along the road. He rationalized facing a beast over getting lost in the opposite direction from there. Part of him worried it signaled an animal in pain or suffering nearby, but he could not stand that possibility without action being taken. He planned to help or end its misery if he came across it directly. He told himself a hunting cry meant the maker sprinted elsewhere away fast. His rifle would stop a head-on collision if it happened unexpectedly, and he headed back towards the truck at a full sprint through the brush, and he moved noisily on purpose to make his presence known. Anything out there already detected his position anyway from earlier. He carried his rifle ready in hand rather than slung on his back as usual, and a round sat chambered in the barrel with the safety switched off. Gun safety ranked highest for his normally in all situations. He advocated it stronger than anyone else around me, in fact. About a mile from the vehicle, he reached an area that smelled horrible beyond words. The stench mixed garbage and decay with other foul notes altogether. He covered his nose with his shirt sleeve to pass through it quickly. A pile of extremely fresh deer guts appeared in the open, clearing area. The source failed to match the smell exactly from a distance. 2 animals' worth of guts and legs sat in a neat pile arranged. The legs looked almost torn off rather than cut clean with tools. No heads, carcasses, or pelts showed nearby. Blood smeared around the area without a typical puddle from the bleeding out process. He looked around for a while to check for poaching evidence present. His passion as an anti-poacher drove the inspection forward carefully. His brain clicked to the conclusion that he had interrupted Bigfoot with his lunch. He booked it out of there to the truck without further delay or pause. He kept his pack on until clear of the mountain entirely, and he refused to buckle up until off-road and driving away. He told my brother and me this story when we got home from school that day without a mission. I felt baffled, since I had never, since that day, seen my dad afraid before. I live in North Texas, near a large wildlife refuge and a lake bigger than my hometown. One night I decided to go down the long gravel road to the dock with a female friend of mine. I usually carry a gun. I left my pistol locked in the glove box by the gate, and the road stretched out about 200 yards to the dock. About 30 yards into the trek I heard a noise on my left. The earth growled and rumbled, and I looked around to pinpoint the sound, but saw nothing. We stood still waiting for it to resume. We heard heavy footsteps instead. The paces moved without crashing or rustling, and I turned to my friend and asked if she wanted to go back. She did not know. We continued to the dock with the growling and rumbling following us. Heavy paces accompanied the sound. I reached for my right hip and was met with a blank space where my holster should have been. I'd left my pistol in the glove box. I grabbed my pocket knife and palmed it, and the rumbling continued. It impacted the air with its weight, and we quickened our pace. It matched ours but stayed in the wood, and this went on for about 300 yards until I arrived to the dock. Bear in mind, I have hunted and camped since I was 6, and I've never heard a sound like this before. My friend sprinted to the edge of the dock. I grabbed rocks and sat beside her, and for 15 minutes it circled the area around the dock landing. Rumbles and growls emanated from 30 to 40 yards away, but darkness obscured it. I had no firearm, and we couldn't see what it was. and I called my buddy Dennis, who lived 5 minutes away, while the rumbling and pacing continued. It did not step onto the dock. Headlights appeared over the trees, and the rumbling then faded into the darkness, and Dennis walked down cradling a rifle, and that ended the incident. Deer and hogs roamed the trails there. I walked those paths many times alone. The gravel road cut through the thickest wood section. My friend stayed close as we walked that night. The growl first sounded like distant thunder. The rumble built from underground vibrations, and the footsteps followed perfectly in rhythm. We covered the full length to the dock, and the knife felt small in my hands. Rocks lay scattered along the water's edge. The circling pattern held steady for 15 minutes. The incident left me unsettled for months. I thought about it every night after. Cryptozoology made sense after that experience. Local cultures tell stories of similar creatures. My brother-in-law went hunting in the hill country outside Austin when he was a teenager. He positioned himself to watch an area for deer in the early morning. Darkness still covered the landscape when he settled into place. A clearing lay ahead with several large rocks scattered across the ground. Silhouettes defined the shapes in the low light, and he waited motionless with his rifle ready across his lap. The air stayed cool and still as dawn approached slowly from the east. He scanned the clearing through his scope at regular intervals. Shadows blended the rocks into the terrain without distinct edges, but one shape sat apart from the others near the tree line. He marked it as a boulder that was too heavy to shift without machinery, and minutes passed while he kept his focus on distant movement among the oaks. Well, at some point, he lowered the scope to rest his eyes, and that's when he looked back across the clearing with naked vision. One of the rocks stood upright from its position. The shape rose smoothly to full height. It turned away from him towards the woods. Heavy steps carried it into the underbrush. Leaves shifted slightly from the passages, yet no branches could be heard breaking under its weight. He froze in place behind his cover, his breath caught short in his throat from the sight. The figure matched no animal he knew from those in the hills. Deer bolted from cover when startled in open grounds. Hogs rooted loudly through brush with tusks gleaming, and this form walked upright on 2 legs alone. Broad shoulders filled the silhouette against the fading dark. He watched until the trees swallowed the shape completely from view, and silence returned to the clearing after the steps had faded. There were no calls echoing from birds or coyotes, and sunlight crept over the ridge. The spot where the rock was stood empty now. Bare earth showed no prints or disturbance in the dirt, and he stayed there for a solid hour before moving. He gathered his gear and hiked back to the truck, parked down the trail, his hands shaking on the steering wheel on the drive home. He told no one about the events for several days. Words failed to describe the motion he witnessed firsthand. Some friends laughed when he finally spoke about his account. He insisted, though, that the shape walked away from him, like it knew he was there. To this day, my brother-in-law believes he saw a Sasquatch in those hills. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope you have enjoyed tonight's collection of Bigfoot stories, and if of course you did, you can show me some love in the comments section below. Of course, it is always very much appreciated. I would also like to give an extra special thanks to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen for all their continued help and support and help keep the channel running. And if you'd like some exclusive perks that you can only get from Patreon, follow the links to find out more. But that's it from me, guys. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.